In the summer of 1980, Poland had been in a fluctuating economic crisis for decades. The communist regime had amassed an incalculable amount of foreign debt, and in an attempt to improve their situation, they began price fixing on basic goods. The increase in food prices caused a wave of unrest around the country, and it certainly wasn't the first time. But it was in the shipyards of Gdańsk where the issue of unbearable working conditions was made personal. A popular crane operator, Anna Valentinowicz, was unjustly fired from her position a few months before her planned retirement. In response to this, her colleagues unionised to demand labour reforms. Led by electrician and close friend Lech Wałęsa, the workers began their illegal strike. Wałęsa and his colleagues knew how the communist authorities would deal with their protest. They had learnt from the violent suppression of their strike 10 years earlier, which saw 75 of their comrades shot dead in the streets. So this time, instead of confronting the communist authorities head-on, they locked themselves inside the shipyard on August 14th. Then, after lengthy discussions between the strike committee and other workplace representatives from around the country, they wrote their demands on wooden boards before placing them on the front of gate number 2. The 21 demands of the strike committee included a number of basic workplace rights, such as paid maternity leave, full medical service for workers, the introduction of penalty rates for weekend work, and of course, the right to strike. It also included larger demands that went beyond issues within the Gdańsk shipyard industry, such as a long-awaited raise in wages, the freedom of speech and press, and the right for trade unions to form independent of the Communist Party. It was this last point that was particularly important, as the unionised shipyard workers would be allowed to form under its now famous name, Solidarność, or Solidarity in English. As word of the strike spread across Poland and further abroad, the international press descended upon the Gdańsk shipyards and awaited eagerly for a result. All the while, the communist authorities had tanks and armoured vehicles stationed outside the shipyard gates, making their presence known. On August 31st, the Inter-Factory Strike Committee finally met with Communist Party delegates in the Occupational Health and Safety building. With a huge crowd gathered outside in support of the strike, as well as the media presence in front of the talks, it was clear to the communist delegates that they were now up against an entire movement. They eventually agreed to sign on the demands. In Polish, this document is known as Porozumienie Sierpniowe, the August Accords. For the first time in half a century, Polish citizens could finally bring about democratic changes within the communist political structure. The Solidarity Trade Union was now more than just a representative body for shipyard workers. It was a movement that swept across the entire country, and what began as a few thousand became 10 million just over a year later, 1/4 of Poland's entire population. The story certainly doesn't end here. The communists would declare martial law in 1981, seeing Solidarity banned and its leaders arrested. But ultimately, the strength of the movement amongst the Polish people was far too great for the regime to ignore. Continuing to be active as an underground organisation, in 1989, Solidarity was finally allowed to form as a political party and participate in the first free elections of the communist era. Lech Wałęsa became the country's first democratically elected president, and Poland was the first country in the Soviet bloc to peacefully transition out of communism. This inspired neighbouring countries to follow suit, and peaceful pro-democratic revolutions rippled across Central and Eastern Europe. By 1991, even the USSR realised it was no longer able to maintain its system. Of course, there were a number of factors that led to the end of communism in Europe. But without a doubt, the agreement struck by Solidarity in 1980 was the first successful blow dealt to the communist system. More importantly, democracy in Poland was achieved through peaceful means, and not by a violent revolution or coup d'etat. Solidarity was a movement born out of the need to support a friend and colleague, and the realisation that when we are united, more can be achieved than anyone ever thought was possible. As Lech Wałęsa would later be quoted, "He who puts his hand out to stop the wheel of history will have his fingers crushed." Such is the power of solidarity. For more English language content on Poland, make sure you hit the subscribe button, as well as the bell for notifications. We can also be found on Facebook and Instagram. at Gdańsk in your pocket. We'll see you next time.